At dinner, she turned our breakup into a show for cameras and friends. I just said, good luck, then walked away. The room froze when she started crying, and no one knew what to do next. The moment she tapped her wine glass with her fork, I already knew what was coming. I just did not know she had chosen tonight to do it. Not with 17 people at the table. Not with a camera crew setting up in the corner for what she had told everyone was a milestone celebration. And definitely not with her best friend Caitlin positioned directly across from me, her phone already angled to record whatever happened next. Isolde set her glass down slowly and deliberately, the way she always did when she wanted the maximum amount of attention from the maximum number of people. She was wearing the red dress, the one she had bought in New York on a trip I had paid for. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was the kind that did not quite reach her eyes. The smile I had come to recognize over 2.5 years, as the one she wore when she was performing rather than feeling. Then she stood up. The table went quiet, and she said, I think it is time I told everyone the truth. Brennan and I are done. 17 people stared at me. The camera crew adjusted their angle. Caitlin leaned forward in her chair like she was watching the championship round of something. I set down my fork. I looked at Isolde for exactly 3 seconds, and then I said, good luck. I pushed back my chair and stood up. What happened in the next 60 seconds is something people who were in that room at Margot's in downtown Nashville still talk about. Because I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not ask why. I did not beg her to reconsider or look around the table for support. I just stood up, calmly, reached for my jacket on the back of the chair, and started buttoning it. And that was when Isolde started crying. My name is Brennan Calloway. I am a 35-year-old emergency room physician at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. I have spent the better part of my career making fast, clear decisions under conditions that would paralyze most people. I have stood in trauma bays at 2 in the morning with someone's life literally in my hands and kept my voice steady enough to direct a team of 8 people. I have delivered news that no family member should ever have to hear, and I have done it with enough composure that they could hold themselves together long enough to understand what came next. None of that prepared me for Isolde Vance. I met Isolde 29 months before that dinner at a fundraiser for the Monroe Street Free Clinic, a charity I had been involved with since residency. She was there with a friend of a friend, wearing a dark blue dress, laughing at something on the other side of the room. And I noticed her the way you notice a storm gathering on the horizon. Beautiful, but with something in the air that should have made you pay attention. She was 28 at the time, a lifestyle content creator, which meant she spent her days building an audience online around what she called intentional living, wellness routines, travel, and relationships. She had around 200,000 followers across her platforms, and she talked about authenticity the way some people talk about religion, with complete conviction and absolutely no irony. I thought I had found someone real underneath the curated surface. For about 6 months, I was right. The Isolde I knew in those first 6 months was sharp and funny and genuinely interested in the world. She would come to the hospital on slow weeknights and sit in the break room waiting for me to have a free hour, and we would talk for as long as the emergency room allowed. She asked good questions about medicine. She told me about growing up in a small town outside Knoxville, about her mother who had worked 3 jobs, and about why she had built something of her own instead of relying on anyone else. She made me feel like she understood what it cost to build something from the ground up, because she had done it too. What I did not understand then was that for Isolde, everything was content, including me. I am not saying she did not feel anything real in those early months. I genuinely believe she did at least some version of it. But somewhere along the way, and I cannot tell you exactly when it shifted, I became less of a person she loved and more of a character in a narrative she was constructing. Brennan, the devoted ER doctor. Brennan, the steady one. Brennan, the backdrop against which Isolde Vance looked like she had it all together. I noticed things slowly, the way you notice a crack in a wall. At first you tell yourself, it is nothing. Then you tell yourself it has been there a while. Then one day you press on it and the whole section crumbles. The first crack was the filming. She had always filmed content around her life, and I had been fine with that in the beginning. A photo here, a video there, with my face mostly kept out of it, which I appreciated. But sometime around month 7 or 8, the camera started showing up in moments that felt private. Arguments softened into honest conversations for her audience. Difficult nights I had after losing a patient were reframed as her being a supportive partner. Our relationship dynamics were analyzed and explained to 200,000 strangers in a voice that sounded thoughtful and reflective, but left no room for my perspective. I told her it made me uncomfortable. She told me I was being controlling. The second crack was the story she told about us versus the one I was actually living. Online, we were a couple who communicated deeply and prioritized growth. In the apartment we had started sharing, 18 months in, we were two people who increasingly wanted different things and had stopped being honest about it. She wanted the relationship to be a platform. I wanted the relationship to be a relationship. She wanted to move to Austin because the content community there was growing. I had a career in Nashville that I had spent a decade building. These were not small differences. These were tectonic. The third crack, and the one I should have paid more attention to, was how she handled disagreement. Isolde did not fight loudly. She did not throw things or raise her voice or say cruel things in the heat of the moment. What she did was more calculated than that. When we disagreed, she would get very quiet, very composed, and then she would find a way to make the conflict into a story, where she was the one who had tried, who had been patient, who had seen it coming. She was always 3 steps ahead of the narrative, always positioning herself. I was an ER doctor. I worked nights and weekends and holidays. I missed events and canceled plans and came home exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with her. And instead of talking to me about it directly, Isolde was apparently collecting those moments like evidence, saving them up, building a case. I did not know that was what she was doing until about 3 weeks before that dinner at Margot's. My colleague and close friend Tyler Marsh had done residency with me at Vanderbilt, and he knew me better than almost anyone. After a shift in early September, he pulled me aside. He had that look on his face, the one I had learned to read over 12 years of friendship, the one that meant he was about to say something I was not going to want to hear. "Have you seen what she has been posting?" he asked. I had not. I had stopped watching Isolde's content closely months ago because it made something in my chest go tight, and I had not fully understood why yet. Tyler showed me his phone. Over the previous 6 weeks, Isolde had posted a series of videos with titles about learning when to let go and what it meant to outgrow a relationship. She had not named me. She did not have to. Anyone who knew us, and a surprising number of her followers, seemed to know exactly who she was talking about. The boyfriend who could not prioritize the relationship. The man who had made her feel invisible. The moment she realized she deserved to be chosen. The most recent one had over 800,000 views. I watched the whole thing standing in the hospital parking garage at 11:30 at night, still in my scrubs, and I felt something cold and clarifying settle over me. Not hurt exactly, though that was there too. Something more like recognition. This was the story she had been building. This was the ending she had written. And she had shared it with nearly 1 million people before she had said a single word of it to me. I went home that night and she was asleep. I did not wake her. I lay on my side of the bed staring at the ceiling and thought through everything very clearly the way I think through a complicated case. Not with emotion, but with sequence. What happened first? What it meant? What came next? What I understood by the time the sun came up was this. Isolde had already ended our relationship publicly. The private version of it, the conversation she owed me, was only a formality to her. And knowing that I had 2 choices, I could keep waiting for the conversation that was coming on her timeline, in her terms, in whatever setting she chose, or I could start quietly preparing for whatever form it took, so that when it arrived, I was ready. I chose the second option. I did not say anything to her about the videos. I did not pick a fight or make accusations. I went back to work. I spent time with Tyler and my other friends. I called my parents in Louisville more regularly than I had in months. And I started very quietly untangling my life from hers. My mail, a storage unit I had been splitting with her, a joint streaming subscription that felt embarrassingly small but was somehow symbolic. I moved things back to their original positions, gently and methodically, like I was reversing a process that had been running for 2.5 years. 3 weeks after Tyler showed me his phone, Isolde came to me with an invitation. Caitlin is organizing a dinner, she said, kind of a milestone thing. She wants to celebrate some news she has. I thought it would be nice if we all went together. She was looking at me with an expression I had seen before, attentive, a little too bright. And something in the back of my mind registered it, but I nodded. I said it sounded fine, because I had nothing to hide and nowhere to be. And if there was something coming, I was not going to run from it. I just was not going to be unprepared for it either. Margot's is on 5th Avenue North in the Gulch neighborhood, which, if you have never been to Nashville, is exactly the kind of restaurant that gets written up in travel magazines. Exposed brick Edison lighting, a wine list that takes itself seriously, the kind of place where the tables are close enough together that a scene would be impossible to contain. I wore a gray suit. I got there first. I shook hands with people I knew and introduced myself to people I did not. Then I settled into my seat, ordered sparkling water, and looked around the room with the same attention I give to a busy trauma bay when I first walk in. Cataloging everything, taking note of who was where and what was happening. Caitlin was there with her boyfriend Rhett. 4 of Isolde's content creator friends were there, 2 of whom I had met before, and 2 of whom I had not. 3 couples from the broader social group Isolde had built over the years were there too. And at the far corner of the room, 2 people from a production company I recognized stood near a camera. I had heard Isolde mention them before in the context of a potential collaboration. They had a setup that was low-key, but visible if you were looking. And I was looking. Isolde arrived 20 minutes after I did. She hugged everyone, laughed, easily sat down across from me, and gave me a smile that I now understood was a performance, not a greeting. She was wearing the red dress. She had ordered a specific wine. She was ready. I was ready too. We ate. The conversation was good, the kind of evening that would have been genuinely enjoyable if I had not understood exactly what it was. Caitlin's news, and there was real news, was that she had been offered a partnership with a major wellness brand. Everyone celebrated her warmly. Rhett gave a toast. People laughed. I laughed too, because it was actually funny, and because whatever was coming, I was not going to spend the hour before it being miserable. Then Isolde tapped her glass. I have replayed what happened next more times than I can count. Not obsessively, but the way you replay a critical decision in the emergency room. Not to torture yourself, but to understand it precisely so you can learn from it. She stood up. She looked around the table with that smile, and she said she had something she wanted to share with everyone. She said this felt like the right group of people. She said she had been on a journey of growth and clarity and self-understanding, and that part of that journey meant being honest about where things were in her life. I think it is time I told everyone the truth, she said. Brennan and I are done. And then she looked at me. 17 people looked at me. Caitlin's phone was recording. The camera in the corner had swung around slightly. Rhett looked uncomfortable. The 2 creator friends who did not know me well were watching with the alert, fascinated expression of people who knew they were witnessing content. I set down my fork. I looked at Isolde for exactly 3 seconds, not with anger, not with devastation, just with the steady level attention of a person who had already processed what this moment cost. And I said, good luck. Then I picked up my jacket, buttoned it, and stood up. I heard her say my name, Brennan. I looked around the table. It was good to see you all, I said, and I meant it. I shook Rhett's hand because Rhett had nothing to do with any of this, and he was actually a decent person. I nodded to the others, and I walked toward the door. I made it about 4 steps before I heard the sound I had not anticipated. Not anger, not shouting, a cry. Isolde behind me had burst into tears. Not performance tears, or at least, I do not think so. Not entirely. I think she had scripted the announcement. She had scripted the moment. She had an idea of how I would respond. Shock maybe, or hurt, or some kind of public fracture that would validate the narrative she had been building. Instead, I had given her 3 seconds of eye contact, 2 words and the back of a gray suit jacket, walking calmly toward the exit. She had not written an ending for that. I paused at the door, not because I was uncertain, but because I am a physician, and I am human, and even when someone has hurt you very deliberately, You do not just switch off the part of yourself that responds to another person's pain. I turned back for a moment. 17 people were still at that table, and not one of them knew what to do next. Caitlin had lowered her phone. The camera in the corner had stilled. Rhett was looking at the tablecloth. Isolde was standing at the head of the table, the red dress and the perfect hair and the careful arrangement of the entire evening crumbling around her. In that moment, she was just a person who had made a choice she could not take back. Learning in real time what it felt like when the other person did not play the part assigned to him. I said nothing else. I walked out, I got into my car, I sat there for a minute, and then I drove home. I want to be honest about what that night felt like because it would be easy to make this story into something cleaner than it was. The truth is sitting in my car outside Margot's. I felt the full weight of 2.5 years ending. I felt grief for the version of Isolde I had believed in during those first 6 months. I felt the particular loneliness of realizing that someone had been building an exit while I was still trying to build a future. I am not made of stone. I drove home. I sat on my couch. I called Tyler, and he came over and we watched college football and did not talk about Isolde at all, which was exactly what I needed. But I did not crack. And I want to explain why because I think it matters. In the emergency room, you learn something early that most people have to discover the hard way. Your emotional response to a crisis is information, not instruction. Feeling fear does not mean you run. Feeling grief does not mean you collapse. Feeling rage does not mean you escalate. You feel all of it. You register all of it. And then you act from the clearest part of yourself, not the loudest part. Isolde had counted on the loudest part of me showing up at that table. She had built a narrative around a version of me that was hurt and reactive and ultimately confirming. She needed me to fall apart to make her story make sense. I declined to do that. Not because I was not hurt, but because I understood clearly and without drama that the relationship was over and had been over for longer than she had let on. The only thing left for me to do was walk out of that room with the same integrity I had walked into it with. That was the decision I made. 2 words and a jacket. The days after were strange in the way stillness after noise is always strange. Isolde posted a video the morning after the dinner, a quiet, tearful reflection on unexpected endings and letting go with grace. By afternoon, it had 300,000 views. She did not mention the dinner specifically. She did not explain that she had announced our breakup in front of a camera crew and 17 people as a kind of structured content moment. She let her audience fill in whatever they wanted. What she had not anticipated was Caitlin. Caitlin and I had never been especially close. She was Isolde's person, not mine. But Caitlin had been at that table and had watched everything happen in real time. I think there was a version of Caitlin who found her friend's behavior that night genuinely troubling. A version of her who watched the crying and realized that the performance had gone somewhere real and uncomfortable. A version of her who decided honesty mattered more than loyalty to a curated narrative. She posted her own video 3 days later. She did not name names either, but she was transparent enough that anyone paying attention understood. She talked about watching someone she loved try to orchestrate a moment for an audience, and about being disturbed by what she saw. She said real endings deserved real privacy. She said using people's pain as content, including your own, had consequences she had not fully understood until that night. By any measure, it was a thoughtful and honest thing to say. Her audience, which had grown significantly in recent months, responded with a conversation I can only describe as genuine. People shared experiences of having their relationships turned into content without their consent. People questioned the ethics of what the word authentic actually meant in a world where every moment was potentially a post. I was not watching any of this closely. Tyler was, and he gave me the broad strokes. But I had made a decision to step away from that world entirely, and I was keeping to it. What I was doing instead was working, sleeping more than I had in months, and running along the Cumberland River on my days off. Something I had stopped doing somewhere in the middle of the relationship, because Isolde kept early hours, and it had seemed considerate to match her schedule. I was calling my parents. I was having dinner with Tyler and his wife Amber, who made a lamb stew that I had been asking her for the recipe to for 3 years, and she kept refusing on principle. My father, a 62-year-old retired contractor from Louisville, and the least sentimental person I have ever met in my life, said something to me on the phone about a week after the dinner that I have been thinking about ever since. He said, "Brennan, you cannot love somebody into treating you right. At some point, you have to accept that who they showed you they are is who they are." He was not talking about Isolde specifically. He never does that. He never inserts himself into the particulars of my life. He was just saying something true in the way he does, out of nowhere, like he had been sitting with it for a while and decided the moment was right. I have been thinking about that sentence for weeks. You cannot love somebody into treating you right. 6 weeks after the dinner at Margot's, I received a message from Isolde. Not a video, not a post, a direct message. Private long, clearly written and rewritten several times. She apologized. Not for ending the relationship, which she had every right to do on its own terms, but for the way she had chosen to do it. For the cameras, for the audience, for the fact that she had turned something real between two real people into a moment designed for consumption. She said she had not realized until after the fact how much she had been treating our relationship as material rather than reality. She said she had spent time talking to a therapist about it, which I believed. She said she was not asking for anything, not forgiveness, not another conversation, just that I knew she understood she had been wrong. I read the message twice. I sat with it for a day, and then I wrote back briefly that I appreciated her saying it and that I hoped she was doing well. That was true. I did hope she was doing well. Whatever Isolde became after this, whoever she chose to be, on the other side of this particular version of herself, I genuinely hoped it was better than the person who tapped a wine glass at Margot's and made a production out of someone else's grief. Because here is the thing about Isolde that I have had a lot of time to understand. She was not malicious in the way that word usually means. She was not calculating cruelty for cruelty's sake. She was a person who had built an entire identity around the performance of her own life, and somewhere along the way, that performance had eaten the life itself. She could not experience something privately anymore. She could not let an ending just be an ending. She needed it to be watched, witnessed, and understood on her terms by an audience who would validate it. That is not a character flaw you can love someone out of. It is something a person has to reckon with on their own. Usually after something goes badly enough that they cannot frame it in a flattering light. I think that night at Margot's might have been that thing for her. I think watching me button my jacket and walk out, watching the room go quiet and her tears fall in front of a camera she had invited and an audience she had orchestrated might have been the first moment in a long time when the performance and the reality diverged so sharply that even she could not edit them back together. I hope she did the work after that. I mean that without a trace of bitterness. 3 months after that dinner, I am still in Nashville, still at Vanderbilt, still running along the river on my days off, still asking Amber for that lamb stew recipe, still going into trauma bays at 2 in the morning and making fast, clear decisions under pressure. I started volunteering again at the Monroe Street Free Clinic, the same charity where I first saw Isolde across a room in a dark blue dress laughing at something. That is not lost on me. But the clinic mattered before she did, and it matters now. And the symmetry of it feels right rather than painful. Tyler asked me recently if I regretted not confronting her sooner, not having it out before it got to that dinner table. I thought about that seriously before I answered. The honest answer is no. Not because I handled everything perfectly. I did not. I stayed in a relationship longer than the evidence warranted because I wanted to believe in the version of Isolde I had met at the beginning, and that cost me months of my life that I could have spent differently. That is on me, and I own it. But the specific decision in that specific moment to stand up and say 2 words and leave with my dignity intact, no, I do not regret that. I think it was the clearest, most honest thing I had done in the relationship in months, maybe years. It was the one moment when I was entirely myself, not performing, not managing, not trying to shape a narrative, just Brennan at a table in Nashville, understanding exactly what was happening and choosing not to let it define him. That is the thing about staying calm when someone expects you to fall apart. It is not a strategy. It is not revenge. It is just knowing who you are clearly enough that someone else's attempt to rewrite you does not take hold. Isolda spent 2.5 years in a relationship with a man she thought she could turn into a story. What she found out at Margot's was that I was a person, not a plot point. 2 words. A jacket. The door. Sometimes, that is all the answer a moment needs.
My name is Brennan Calloway. I am an emergency room physician in Nashville, Tennessee, and the most important thing I have learned from working in emergency medicine and from living a real human life is the same thing said different ways. In the ER, we call it composure under pressure. Everywhere else, we call it knowing yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is 2 words, and the most important thing you can do is walk out the door. Not because you have given up, but because you have already done the work of knowing exactly what you are worth, and you are not willing to negotiate it down for anyone. Not even in front of cameras. Not even in front of 17 people watching to see what you will do next. Not even for someone in a red dress who expected you to perform the ending she wrote for you. Isolde did not lose me because she ended things. She lost me the moment she decided my pain was content. That is the truth I carried out of Margot's, and that is the truth I kept when the videos came, when the comments came, when the apologies came, and when the silence finally settled over everything. Someone can spend months treating you like a character in their own show, and still be shocked when you refuse to perform the scene they wrote for you. But your reaction in a hard moment says everything about who you are. Not what you feel, what you do with it. 2 words. A jacket. The door. That was not coldness. That was me knowing exactly what I was worth and refusing to negotiate it down for someone who had already made up her mind. I did not have to make a scene. I only had to make a decision. And once I made it, I walked out with my dignity intact.